Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. So for today's video, I'm going to be doing my August reading wrap up. So August was actually a pretty good reading month for me. My goal was to read 10 books and I read 8. So I didn't completely meet my reading goal, but I got pretty close and I actually read some really good books. So I'm pretty happy with it. So the first book that I read in the month of August was The Paper Palace by Miranda Cowley Heller. I also did do a reading vlog on the first 3 books that I'm going to mention that I read this month. So if you want to see more of my in-depth reactions to things and immediate thoughts on these books, you should definitely check that out. I will link it in the iCard. The Paper Palace basically follows Ellie, who is this 54-year-old woman, I believe, and she has 3 kids. She has a husband named Peter, and basically every summer, I believe, she goes to this paper palace, which is her grandfather's home. The house is called the Paper Palace because it literally the walls are made of this certain paper material, but it's basically on this lake and beach type vibe, so think lake house, beach house vibes. This summer, in the middle of dinner, while her spouse and Jonas, her childhood best friend's spouse, are in the kitchen laughing and everything, Ellie ends up leaving and she goes to the back side of the house and she actually ends up having sex with Jonas, literally hooking up with him outside of the house. Meanwhile, both of their spouses are inside. So the book then takes place between past and present. So the present tense is taking place over the course of a weekend. So the weekend that Ellie and Jonas are at the Paper Palace, Ellie has to make the decision, is she going to stay with Peter, her husband, of 30 years or something like that, or is she going to leave him and be with Peter, her childhood lover and the guy that she's really in love with. I personally just didn't really like this book because the way it was marketed was more of a romance book of Ellie having to choose between her husband and Jonas, and so I was expecting it to be more of a romance book, who's she gonna choose? But the reality of the situation is that the book just ended up being more learning about Ellie. You learned way too much about her, and I will say for this book that this book needed major trigger warnings. From everyone I've seen, nobody has mentioned the trigger warnings of sexual assault for this book, not even the author. That also kind of influenced my reading for this book, so that kind of upset me. So I do just want to put that out there, if you're uncomfortable with that or you don't want to read about that, please do not read this book. Like I said, I felt you weren't way too much about Ellie and not enough about her relationship with Jonas or Peter. And I understand that the author really wanted us to learn more about Ellie so that you can understand the decision that she ultimately makes. So I would say if this book was marketed more as a book that's about how your past can influence your current decisions and who you are as a person, I would have rated it higher. But because it was marketed as a romance book, because it just didn't fulfill my romance expectations, because there were no trigger warnings, I rated it a 2 out of 5 stars. The second book that I read this month is Every Summer After by Carly Fortune, and I actually loved this book so much I ended up giving it 5 stars. But I also read this because one of the book clubs I'm part of on campus read this book, and so I read the book along with them. I would say this is a perfect summer romance book. Every Summer After follows the love story of Percy and Sam. Percy lives in Canada, and every summer her family goes to this little lake house that they ended up buying, and her next door neighbor Sam ends up becoming her best friend. It's just so cute because it's that childhood friends to lovers. What ends up happening is Sam's mom dies of cancer, and Percy has not talked to Sam for I believe 15 years, and one day she gets a call from Sam's brother Charlie, and he tells her, our mom has died, I really think you should be there at the funeral, because Sam and Charlie's mom was basically a mom to Percy as well. So she shows up, all these feelings kind of start to redevelop between her and Sam. So the book once again does go past and present, and then you eventually find out why they stopped talking. Let me just say, I kind of predicted what was gonna happen, but I still was jaw on the floor because there were still some mini plot twists or information that got revealed that I was shocked about. This book does have spice, I'm going to say that. I'd say this was like a level 4 spice. I just loved this book so much. I think the character development was like perfection. Even though the whole book is being told from Percy's point of view, you learn so much about her and about Sam. I felt like they just had the cutest relationship. I personally just love Sam. He just like gives such wholesome vibes, like such good wholesome boyfriend vibes, that I was like, I love you, like you can do no wrong. The book that I read after this was Here's to Us by Ellen Hildebrand. This was actually my first Ellen Hildebrand book I read, and it was mainly because Sarah Caroli loves Ellen Hildebrand's books and I really wanted to read one, so I read this one. Here's to Us basically follows Deacon Thorope, who's like this famous chef in New York City, ends up dying suddenly. As part of his will, he requires his best friend to gather his wife and his ex-wife. So he has two ex-wives. One is Laurel and one is Belinda, and Belinda's a famous actress. Laurel is like a community service worker. He requires them and all their respective children to go to Nantucket, which is where he has like this beach house that he bought, and he wants them all to like stay in the house together as they like carry out his wishes for his bodily departure. That's probably not the best way to put that, but for basically like the spreading of his ashes. The wives don't really get along though, because two of the wives Deacon has like cheated on, and that's how they ended up getting married, if that makes sense. So like the first wife, Laurel, he cheated on her with Belinda and then left her for Belinda and got married to her. And then Belinda he left for Charlotte, who is like his most recent wife, or like his wife at the time when he dies. It's told over the course of 5 days, and it's basically just detailing like the drama. It does kind of alternate in between, which this book there's no chapters, which kind of annoyed me, but it does kind of alternate back and forth between which character is talking. I like enjoyed this book, but I do think that sometimes it kind of got slow. Like halfway through the book I kind of wanted to DNF it, because none of the wives really liked each other. I was expecting there to be like loads of drama, and I feel like all the drama kind of just ended up happening at once, and it wasn't even that dramatic. Like it was all just one big argument and then everything was resolved the next day. I also just didn't really like a lot of the characters. Like the only characters I didn't mind were the children. I knew that on Goodreads people also kind of had mixed reviews about it, so I think I ended up giving this book 2.75 stars, because I was like, it's not quite 3 stars, just because I did kind of want to DNF it and it just felt like it was very dragged out. And I feel like this book is a good example of like a book that has an epilogue that just rushes to wrap everything up and doesn't actually close out the book well. Like it kind of just is like, okay, everything's good, and it moves on. I read Ugly Love. Colleen Hoover. Oh my god, this book was 5 stars for me, you guys. I am officially on the Colleen Hoover train. I was such a hater before, I'm not even gonna lie. I was like, oh, she's overrated. And I think that's because I had started by reading November 9, which definitely is not her best book. Ugly Love follows Miles and Tate. Miles is like this kind of closed off guy. He's a pilot. Tate and Miles meet because Miles is neighbors with Tate's brother, and Tate moves in with her brother in the intern. They kind of have like a bad first meeting, so they agree to kind of like start over. You can see like from the beginning that they have this like chemistry for each other. They agree to just hook up and nothing else, because Miles is like, I don't do relationships. He sets 2 rules for their agreement. You can't ask about the past and don't expect a future. I think the way that the story is just told is, it's so good. It's literally so good. I have like no words. I feel like the book does such a good job at telling like the parts of love that can be messy. The story is being told from Tate's point of view, but I think it's really more a story about Miles. So you see character development with Miles, you don't really see it with Tate. The plot twist in this had me for a loop. I literally almost started crying when I found out the plot twist. I was not predicting it at all, but I literally finished this book in like a day. It's a romance story, but it's so much more than that. After that, I read Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. Sorry for the lighting change. I closed the blinds because there was like someone in the parking garage across, literally just like sitting in his car and like watching. And like it was just kind of creepy. Like I don't know if he was watching me, because this is a very tall apartment building. I'm like, he could have been looking at anyone else, but it was creeping me out. This book goes into detail about the romance between Patroclus and Achilles. So if any of you are familiar with Greek mythology, the book takes place over the course of the war at Troy, the Trojan War. Because this book is dealing with Greek mythology. I would say if you don't like Greek mythology, you may not enjoy this book as much. I personally really liked the story because not only did you get to know about Patroclus and Achilles in a more like personal level, but you also got to learn about like all the other characters in Greek mythology. The story follows the love story of Patroclus and Achilles, and it basically just starts with like when Patroclus is young. So the book is being told from Patroclus's point of view, but it starts with when he's young and he gets exiled from his family and he gets sent to this other palace, and that's where he meets Achilles and they form a friendship, which eventually turns into a romantic relationship. I didn't really know anything about Achilles, so it was interesting to really learn about their relationship. So I found this book very entertaining because I like Greek mythology. I knew about the Trojan War, so I was following along. I knew many of the characters that were in the story. I ended up giving this book 2 stars. It just kind of felt slow for me at times. I feel like they kind of dragged out like the Battle of Troy, which I understand, like the Battle of Troy was long. It was like over 10 years long, but I feel like we didn't need to hear about it for what felt like 10 years. It was just like an average fiction book. Like nothing about it surprised me, but I think that's because I know Greek mythology and so I knew what was going to happen. But I would say if you're like new to Greek mythology or you want to get into it, this is probably a good book for you. And the romance subplot is very cute. After Song of Achilles, I read Heartbones by Colleen Hoover because after Ugly Love, I was like, I gotta get my hands on another Colleen book. I actually read this on my Kindle. Heartbones follows Bea, who is this girl who has lived in poverty her whole entire life, and her mom dies of addiction, and as a result of that, she goes to live with her dad. But when she goes to live with her dad, she doesn't like tell him at first that her mom died, so she just doesn't really have a close relationship with either of her parents because her mom's an addict and she lives with her mom, and then her dad she sees like I think once a year, and they don't really have a close relationship. She meets this guy named Samson who lives next door. They kind of come from 2 different worlds. Like Samson is this guy who's like super rich, his family owns like multiple homes, and Bea literally has lived in hunger and poverty. They both kind of realize that they both don't like to share secrets, and so for some reason they just are like drawn to each other, and Samson and Bea kind of develop this friendship. It eventually turns into a romance. There is like a big plot twist. I do think this book, it just kind of wrapped up very quickly. This book was pretty mid. Like to me it reminded me a lot of November 9. It was a young adult novel. I gave it 3 stars, or like 3.25. It made me feel like I was watching 2 missing puzzle pieces find their way to each other and make the puzzle complete. That's all I have to say. I don't really remember this book, so I'm gonna move on. Beautiful Day by Ellen Hildebrand follows the story of Jenna's wedding, Jenna Carmichael. She is getting married, and unfortunately her mom died of, I believe, breast cancer like 9 years ago. But before her mom died, her mom made this notebook including details like to the dot of everything Jenna is to do for her wedding. In true Ellen Hildebrand fashion, there's no chapters, but each chapter is kind of told from a different person at the wedding party's like perspective. Majority of the book is told from Margot's perspective. Margot is Jenna's older sister and also the maid of honor at her wedding. I felt really bad for Margot too because I feel like her mom, even from the grave, was dragging her through the mud. I feel like her mom was like, you need to do this, you need to do that, you need to do this, all for Jenna. And I was like, the fact that her mom made this giant notebook of instructions for Jenna but not for Margot was also just like so rude. Jenna's getting this grand $1,000 wedding that their father's paying for, and Margot meanwhile has to like deal with all this crap on top of like her own issues going on in her life. There's a lot of secrets that get revealed at this wedding. True Ellen Hildebrand fashion of no chapters and like learning about the weekend. I honestly hated this book. I gave it a 1 star. Literally, I started the book and on the first page, I was like, oh, why am I reading this? Like, I immediately was like, I don't want to be reading this. The concept sounded so interesting to me, but then I started reading the book and I was like, oh my gosh, this is so boring. It just gave like way too much detail about certain things that just were not important. Like, how many different ways do you want to describe the fact that she's wearing a pink dress? You can just say she's wearing a pink dress. We don't need to go into like every single detail of the material, the sparkle, the length, whatever. I also feel like with this book, it was very noticeable to me Ellen Hildebrand trying to be woke. Like this book, I believe, was written in 2019, And I feel like Ellen Hildebrand was really trying to be like, I may be old, but is that rude to call her old? Well, she's older. I feel like she was like, I'm older, but I'm still hip, I'm still woke. And I was like, girl, no, you're not. It honestly just like annoyed me so much because Ellen like throws in her books like one person of color character, and then she like tries to make them witty, but it almost comes off in the wrong way because I'm like, literally she talked about in this book how like one of the characters was the only person of color at this wedding, and they saw like another person of color in the wedding staff, and they literally like went up to that person and were like, hey, did you know that Frederick Douglass lived here? I'm sorry, what? Like, what person of color goes up to another person of color to make conversation and is talking about a historical person of color? I feel like she just kind of throws that into there because she wants it to seem like she's woke and she knows things, but in reality she doesn't. But I'm also like, why are you doing that? You can honestly read my Goodreads review because I kind of tore the book to shreds. The last book I read was We Were Liars by E. Lockhart. This was another book that I read on my Kindle. It follows the story of Caddy or Candace, and she and her family, the Sinclairs, are like this very wealthy family. They have like a very rich history living in Massachusetts because they own this island called Beechwood that's literally like off the coast of Massachusetts. So kind of think of like Cape Cod. But literally the Sinclairs, her granddad all the time mentions how like they came over on the Mayflower, and I'm like, I don't know if that's really something you want to brag about, sir. Like, given history, I don't think it's fun to brag about you came over on the Mayflower. The whole idea is that the Sinclairs are like very proud. The Sinclairs don't apologize, they don't make mistakes, they're just like this very high esteemed family, or that's what they think. Every single summer, Candace and her family go to Beechwood, and Candace, two of her cousins and one of her cousins' like friends, the four of them get coined the term liars. One summer, Candace has an accident and it results in her having brain damage, and she no longer goes back to Beechwood. She's on like tons of medication because the doctors can't figure out what's wrong with her. Candace's mom becomes like a helicopter parent. Eventually Candace is allowed, like her mom finally lets her go back to Beechwood because it's been 2 summers since she last has been there. She's like asking a bunch of people like questions, and she's like, what happened to me? Like, why can't I remember this? Like, people are telling her things and she doesn't remember. Her mom keeps getting mad at her and being like, I told you this already, how do you not remember? But I think her mom just doesn't realize like how bad her brain damage is. The book is told from Candace's point of view, and this book is definitely like a mystery book because it's like the whole time you're going through it with Candace where you're trying to figure out like what happened to me, like why is everybody acting so weird, like why won't they let me go swimming, why are they forcing me to hang out with the cousins that are like 2, 5, 6 years old, like why do I have to hang out with them, why can't I hang out with my cousins who are also 18, just what's going on. She's very disoriented. I personally really like the book because I didn't want to put it down just because of the mystery aspect. I'm glad I honestly read it on my Kindle because I was highlighting and annotating. I was like, is it this, like did this happen? This was the first like mystery book that I read, so I actually liked it a lot. Overall, I gave this book 3 stars. I felt like it was a pretty good book. I will say that the ending I kind of hated. Once the truth of what happened to Caddy was revealed, I was very confused just because of the way that they like revealed the truth in the book. I just was so confused. I was like, what? And then all of a sudden it was like the very next chapter was the end of the book. I did overall enjoy the book. Like I love trying to figure everything out, but it is a young adult novel, so it's like very easy to read. I read it very quickly. I didn't hate it, but I didn't love it. Those are all the books that I read in the month of August. Let me know down below if you read any of these books, like what your thoughts are. Don't forget to subscribe and give this video a thumbs up if you liked it. I have so much more college content coming and book content. I will also link my Goodreads down below, so if you want to see like what books I'm currently reading and my reactions to them right after I finish them, you can watch that. But that is it for me, and I will see you all in my next video. Bye!